Ah, the Elder Scrolls series, a very beloved franchise that has helped push the gaming industry forward. It's so popular that not only have they re-released Skyrim for the 28th time, but chances are everyone you know has at least heard its name in some capacity. Every one of the games is open world, even the very first game that came out back in the 90s. Crazy to think how far the franchise has come, from randomly generated terrain in Arena all the way to the handcrafted world of Skyrim. This franchise is huge. Don't even get me started with the rabbit hole that is the lore of the series. There are so many channels on YouTube that just go over the lore itself. It's insane, and you'll never run out of topics to look up. The Elder Scrolls alone held Bethesda Game Studios up before they acquired the Fallout IP. If you think about it, how many games on Xbox 360 and PS3 were fully traversable open-world games? I guarantee the first one to come to mind, for some of you anyway, was Skyrim, Oblivion, or even Fallout. That era of consoles still had a tough time working with such huge worlds. It's why you only now see people complaining about there being too many open-world games. Back then, they were a pretty rare occurrence, even rarer if it just worked. The Elder Scrolls was first developed by Bethesda Softworks itself before the new Bethesda Game Studios took over the franchise with a third entry. But before even the first game in the series, Bethesda Softworks was known for games like Hockey League Simulator and The Terminator. Pretty much games that they didn't own the intellectual properties to. The Elder Scrolls was a good foray into owning their own IP. Having complete creative control is something most developers only dream of now outside of the indie scene. But like so many long-running franchises, they tend to become different in many ways as they continue. For instance, the very first game in the franchise, The Elder Scrolls Arena, starts the franchise very differently from what we know of today. There are elements of the game that translate differently or are retconned in later games. As an example, did you know that the cat-like race of Khajiit weren't always cat-like? That guy looks like a luchador! But going back to the franchise as a whole, the games are made with many years between the various entries. Currently, we're on the 12th year since Skyrim came out, and Elder Scrolls 6 is still years away from being released. Honestly, we're definitely going past the 15-year mark between 5 and 6. One thing parent company ZeniMax did to alleviate this was to have another studio make an MMO in the series, The Elder Scrolls Online. Still though, with Elder Scrolls 6 being in early development, what better time for me to look at the series from beginning to current? With that in mind, put on some baggy jeans and bring out your pogs. We're going back in time to 1994 to take a deep dive into the game that started it all, The Elder Scrolls Arena. Alright, first and foremost, I want to preface something. The Elder Scrolls Arena is a video game from 1994. Because of this, it's not a game with modern game design practices. It is a product of its time in the mid-90s, so everything you see here is obviously not indicative of the quality of the rest of the franchise. That aside, let's hop into the gameplay. Arena plays very differently from current Elder Scrolls. It's only available on PC and has no controller support. I mean, it is from the 90s after all. But because of when it came out, they didn't use the typical WASD keys on your keyboard for movement. Oh no, they made you move with the arrow keys. But wait, there's more!
But wait, there's more!
They even put in movement by clicking close to the edges of the screen, something very different and unexpected. Click movement is not only based on where you click, but also how close to the edge your mouse is. Overall, it's very inefficient to use, especially while in combat. I'd really recommend the use of the arrow keys instead. Getting items on the ground is as easy as clicking on the object. However, since they have movement tied to the outer window, you'll sometimes find yourself moving instead of collecting. All the makings of a nearly 30-year-old game. Even combat shows its age. If you want to swing your weapon at an enemy, you need to right-click your mouse and swing your arm like no tomorrow. Sure, this is definitely a different way to go about using your weapons, but it is very easy to understand. Rather than just clicking or aiming, you're swinging your arm until you almost knock yourself out. Using magic is as easy as figuring out which button you need to click on in order to bring up the magic menu, clicking the spell you want to use, then clicking on the enemy in question. The hardest part is remembering which button it is. Also, the hardest part is making sure you can use it in combat before you die. But the hardest part is making sure you don't die before you can use it. Crazy, right? Using items is the exact same thing. Find the button you need to click on, then chug that health potion so you die later instead, sometimes in the exact same fight. Speaking of death and dying, this game is tough. So tough that I had to make like 4 or 5 different characters because I kept forgetting to save before dying. By the way guys, after you create your character, make sure you save. Now, I don't mean just tough in difficulty, I mean tough in how the game is balanced. When you pick up a new video game from the store, it's typically made to have some amount of balance in it. Normal game balancing will start you out with the enemies around your level, enough of a challenge for you as you learn the game. You'll slowly ramp up in difficulty as you get closer and closer to the end of the game. They might throw a really tough enemy in some spots, but they're typically optional. Arena, on the other hand, will give you rats and goblins in your starting dungeon, and then you open a door and BAM! You just got one shot by a random enemy that's already stronger than you. Obviously a skill issue. So unless you know what you were doing, and are lucky, you're going to be reloading the game quite often. So not only is the game not very well balanced with the enemies, but it's also not very well balanced towards the player. Get even slightly better gear, and you can find yourself taking down enemies that gave you a hard time before with ease. There is a level system in this game too. Most, if not all, of your experience gained will be from killing monsters and going through the many, many dungeons the game has to offer. At the end of the day, this isn't your typical Elder Scrolls game. This is a dungeon crawler. The land outside of towns and cities is all procedurally generated, even the dungeons you find out in the wilds. While I can't say there's too much variety from how the dungeons are, I can say that it's still a fun experience. In towns and cities, you have people walking around that you can ask a variety of questions. Questions such as who they are, where certain things are like inns and shops, and even ask about rumors. Asking about rumors will sometimes net you a quest to follow. Also, if you have your weapon out, the citizens won't stop to talk to you. You can still catch them to talk, but it's so much easier if you put your weapon away. With all of that said, the gameplay isn't bad. It might not be great by today's standards, but it is serviceable for the occasional player that's curious to see where Elder Scrolls started. And serviceable still means playable. My experience went from lots of reloading saves to being able to continue the main quest fairly easily. Speaking of the main quest, let's hop right into the story. The story of the Elder Scrolls Arena is a simple one. An evil mage named Jagar Tharn traps the Emperor in a plane of oblivion with a Staff of Chaos, split the staff into 8 parts and hid them throughout the world, impersonated the Emperor, and put the player in prison. You have a ghost named Rhea Silmain telling you the locations of each piece of the staff. It's up to you, the player, to escape your prison, gather all 8 pieces of the staff, and put a stop to Tharn's evil schemes and save the Emperor. That's it. That's the whole story. It's easy to follow. It gives you an objective right off the bat, and it puts you at the forefront of everything that happens. There's an interesting concept that the devs added to the game. While you have Rhea talking to you in your dreams, sometimes you'll also have Tharn talking to you as you get further and further into the main questline. His goal is to stop you, so he'll taunt you and send his minions after you. If you die, he can pop up taunting you even further. Jagar Tharn is a very classic evil man. He's also the only boss enemy in the entire game. Remember, this game was made in 1994. Dungeon crawlers were probably the big thing at the time. Some didn't even have stories, so the fact that Arena has one puts it in a different tier above most of them. By the way, there is another Tharn you meet in Elder Scrolls Online. Main quests aside, the various side quests do have stories to them, but they tend to be limited to what the quest needs done. For example, saving a king's sister from the Dark Brotherhood. You say yes, head to the dungeon, save her, bring her back to the king, and you get money. That's about as far as that goes. Alright, let's switch on over to the world and setting. Now, imagine the Elder Scrolls world in your head. Lush green forests, sand-covered deserts, magic, monsters, politics, Skyrim. Now, imagine that, but in 1994. Crazy, right? As I did say earlier, the game world is procedurally generated. No 2 players' worlds will look exactly the same. However, you do also have access to the entire continent of Tamriel. something none of the other games in the franchise have done since, the closest one being Elder Scrolls Online, but that's still being added to over time. Traveling to any location needs to be done from the map. When you open the map, you can see every province and every town and city within said province. They even have cities like Whiterun, Winterhold, and Riften in the exact same locations as they are in Skyrim. It's a nice little detail that the future games base their maps off of what was in Arena. The Elder Scrolls Arena takes place in the Third Era. While Arena is the first Elder Scrolls game, it's not first in the timeline. That honor goes to ESO. But being in the Third Era lets the devs have a lot of freedom in their lore writing. That's 2 full eras before Arena, and even earlier than that if need be. But does Arena take advantage of the lore? Not really. Since the story is so simple, the writing also translates like that to the lore. It's a bit bare bones. While there is lore, this is also the first game in the series, so it was still trying to find its footing. Think of it as set up for what's to come in the later games. It's still a simple format when compared to its future predecessors. While dungeons and caves do exist in other games, Arena is bathed in the dungeon crawler formula. So because of this, we have dungeons everywhere. It's a major part of the world of the Elder Scrolls Arena. So, the Elder Scrolls Arena was definitely an interesting time to play. Going back to play a game from nearly 30 years ago is basically a culture shock at this point. Game design sure has come a long way since then. Going from flat, procedurally generated terrain all the way to handcrafted mountains. This series sure has come a long way. Sure, handcrafted mountains are in pretty much every game now, but back in the early 90s, most games were two-dimensional. Or Doom. All in all, while Arena definitely won't be everyone's cup of tea, I can still recommend it for someone who's curious to see how it is. The Time Before Skyrim. And the others. Anyone that wants to try the game can do so for free on Steam. As far as I know, it'll likely be free either for a really long time or forever. And if that opens you up to wanting to see more, Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall is also free on Steam. Which, by the way, is the next game that I'll be going over in this retrospective series of the Elder Scrolls. So, if you enjoyed this video, I have plenty more where that came from, and with more videos on the way. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have a fantastic day. Adios.